Hello and welcome to the session. Today, we'll be dealing with Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath was one of the most dynamic and admired poets of the 20th century. By the time she took her life at the age of 30, Plath had already had a following in the literary community. In the ensuing years, her work attracted the attention of a multitude of readers who saw in her singular verse an attempt to catalogue despair, violent emotion, and obsession with death. In the New York Times Book Review, Joyce Oates describes Plath as one of the most celebrated and controversial post-war poets writing in English. Now, in this quote by Jacqueline Rose, we see that Plath was an amalgam of a writer and a woman. That particular form of fragmentation and an indirect kind of representation, which was very unique. She was intensely autobiographical, and it seems that her poems explores her own mental anguish and her troubled marriage to fellow poet Ted Hugh, her unresolved conflicts with her parents, and her own vision of herself. She was born in 1932 in Boston. Plath was the daughter of a German immigrant college professor, Otto Plath, and one of his students, Aurelia Schober. Sylvia Plath's early years were spent near seashore, but her life changed abruptly when her father died in 1940 due to complications arising out of undiagnosed diabetes. Some of her most vivid poems, including the well-known Daddy, concern her troubled relationship with her father and her feelings of betrayal when he died. In the poem Daddy, she says, I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do, but they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. Well, this is Sylvia expressing her feeling. This had another particular incident also. This was written immediately after her first medically documented suicide attempt. Financial circumstances forced Plath family to move to Wellesley, Massachusetts, where Aurelia Plath is teaching advanced secretarial studies at Boston University. Now, during that period, she does gain a semblance of balance, but in August of 1953, at the age of 20, Plath attempts suicide by swallowing sleeping pills. She survived the attempt, but she had to be hospitalized for over 6 months, receiving treatment with electroshock therapy and insulin treatments. Her experiences of breakdown and recovery were later turned into fiction for her only published novel, The Bell Jar. Now, it was during this time that Aurelia Schober discovers that Sylvia has another talent, and this talent is none other than poetry. Now, Sylvia says, I had fallen into a new way of being happy. The young girl does prosper. Sylvia Plath was a gifted student who had won numerous awards and had published stories and poetry in national magazines while still in her teens. She attended Smith College on a scholarship and continued to excel, winning a Mademoiselle fiction contest one year and garnering a prestigious guest editorship of the magazine the following summer. This is Sylvia Plath during that particular period, full of energy. Yet there were moments when there were slight deviations from the happy self. She writes, I still do not know myself. Perhaps I never will. I'm afraid of getting older. I'm afraid of getting married. I want, I think, to be omniscient. I think I would like to call myself the girl who wanted to be God. Never, never will I reach the perfection I long for with all my soul. It was during her undergraduate years that Plath began to suffer the symptoms of severe depression that would ultimately lead to her death. In one of her journal entries dated June 20th, 1958, she does write, It is as if my life were magically run by two electric currents, joyous positive and despairing negative. Whichever is running at the moment dominates my life, floods it. This is an eloquent description of bipolar disorder. It's also known as manic depression. It's a very serious illness for which no genuinely effective medications were available during Plath's lifetime. This is Sylvia Plath during her college days. Now, having made a recovery, Plath returns to Smith's College for her degree. She earned a Fulbright grant to study at Cambridge University in England, and it was there that she met poet Ted Hugh. They were together, and the period of their courtship was immensely intense. They wrote poetry to each other and excelled in writing superb pieces of poetry. They absolutely adored each other's company. The two were married in 1956. And this was amazing because they had been courting each other for just a few months. These are pictures of Sylvia Plath during their early days, early happy days. Now, Sylvia adored him. He was very simply the only man I've ever met whom I could never boss, Sylvia had confided to her friends. Plath publishes two major works during her lifetime, The Bell Jar and a poetry titled The Colossus. Now, both do receive warm reviews. Now, during this time, they had a daughter, Frida. She was born in 1960, and a son, Nicholas. Sylvia struggled to perform her roles as a mother, a wife, and a writer. Her writing had become frantic during this time. Now, in June 1962, there happened a car accident. This was an unusual event because Sylvia drives her own car off the curb and the car is broken up even after several whoops and turns, but Sylvia doesn't actually suffer major injury. It was in July 1962 that Ted was found to be having an affair with Asia. Now, feminists portray Plath as a woman driven to madness by a domineering father, an unfaithful husband, and the demands that motherhood made on her genius. Some critics actually lauded her as a confessional poet whose work spoke the hectic, uncontrolled things our conscience needed or thought it needed. This is Sylvia Plath with Frida and Nicholas. In 1960, she publishes Colossus and she starts writing full time. In 1962, she has an appendix operation, soon followed by the birth of Nicholas. It is during this particular period that her personal life was also traumatized. Now, the couple had decided to move from their Boston home to the country to immerse fully in writing. And it was during this particular period that the Platts were visited by the Weevils. David and Asia came to inspect the home, and it was during that particular visit that Sylvia Plath discovered that Ted Hugh seemed to have his eyes only for Asia, and she noticed something amiss. Now, Plath and Hugh, they had a tumultuous relationship. Now, Sylvia was attracted by his physical power, his voice, and the way he had his animals, and his powerful poetry, his imagery. And what was even more appealing was that Sylvia Plath was absolutely enjoying the encouragement that gave to Sylvia. And at the bottom of all this, she feared a particular fear which only she could really understand. She feared losing him. This is Sylvia Plath with Nicholas, and In the other picture, she's seen as a happy person in the company of Ted Hughes' parents. Yet her life changes. So Plath is, in effect, evolving in poetic voice from a precocious girl to the disturbed modern woman, to the vengeful magician, to Ariel, the god's lioness. So we see a change in her personal as well as her creative self also. It was the same year that Nicholas was born that Ted Hugh is leaving Sylvia for another poet, Asia, who we had mentioned earlier. Now, he had been unfaithful throughout their short marriage, but it was Asia who came into their life and took Hugh away completely. This was immediately after the birth of Nicholas, and this was a very problematic period. Hughes once summarizes Plath's unique personality and talent. He says that she had a language, a unique and radiant substance, which is the product of an amalgamy on a nobler scale. And her elements were extreme, according to Ted Hughes. A violent, almost demonic spirit in her opposed a tenderness and capacity to suffer and love things infinitely, which was just as great and far more in evidence. Despite knowing all this, he did leave her. Her stormy, luminous senses assaulted a downright practical intelligence that could probably have dealt with anything. Now, this was Ted Hughes on Sylvia. However, their marriage did end. The end of her marriage happened in September 1962. This left Plath with two young children to care for. And after an intense burst of creativity in October, when she was, found to write 26 poems in a month, and this resulted in the poetry collection called as Ariel, which was published later. Now, in 1963, Sylvia goes to her doctor and she is prescribed medication for her chronic depression. She is even advised to keep a nurse because she is found to be unable to take care of herself. And it is during this particular time that she suffers terribly. It was the bitterest month of winter when water froze in the pipes and it was immensely cold. It was during that particular period that she goes to the kitchen, writes a note saying, "Call the doctor," and she later seals off all the windows and doors with wet towels and puts her head inside the stove and commits suicide. Now, in the year 1965, the collection called Ariel was published. And in the year 1982, she is posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature too. There lies Sylvia Plath. She was hardly 30 when she decided that her life does need to end. The Plath legend was brief and contained. It was a taut, austere stage drama set in a few bleak, sparsely furnished rooms. Plath's intimate letters to her family contain unguarded personal commentary on her college years, writing, despair, friendship, her relationship with her mother, her marriage, and children. There is something sinister in her end too, because Sylvia Plath committed suicide by poisoning herself inside the stove. Ted Hughes marries Asia Weevil and they have a daughter Shura. But Asia Weevil, when Shura was 4 years old, is found in the stove in the same manner, having poisoned herself and her daughter Shura.